There is a quiet movement happening in some people, and almost no one talks about it because it doesn't look dramatic from the outside. These people are not becoming cold, antisocial, or emotionally broken. They are not withdrawing because they hate others or fear connection. They are simply choosing solitude over self-betrayal. There is no announcement, no rupture, no emotional spectacle. They don't burn bridges. They don't explain themselves. They just step back. Fewer messages, fewer obligations. Fewer relationships that require them to constantly adjust, tolerate, or silence something inside. From the outside, it can look like disinterest or emotional distance, but internally, something very precise is happening. A line has been crossed, not by anger but by awareness. At some point, their nervous system learned that staying connected was costing too much, that being present required shrinking, over-adapting, or ignoring subtle signals of discomfort. And once the mind recognizes that pattern, it stops negotiating. Not loudly, not aggressively, just firmly. These people don't reject connection itself. They reject connections that require them to perform, overgive, or abandon their inner coherence. Solitude becomes preferable not because it is ideal, but because it is clean. In solitude, there is no pressure to explain feelings, no need to manage someone else's emotional instability, no background anxiety of being misunderstood. Silence feels safer than constant adjustment. Distance feels calmer than proximity that demands self-erasure. What makes this movement invisible is that it doesn't follow the usual narrative of pain. There is no collapse, no crisis, no obvious wound. Instead, there is a subtle tightening of boundaries and a quiet reclaiming of inner space. These people are not running away. They are conserving something valuable. They are choosing internal alignment over external approval, integrity over attachment at any cost. If this resonates, pay attention to what your system might be protecting. And if this perspective gave you clarity, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stay here. Comment below what you recognized first in yourself: the exhaustion, the withdrawal, or the relief that came with choosing solitude. Mary Ainsworth observed this pattern clinically, not philosophically or poetically, but through direct study of how the human attachment system responds to safety and threat. In her work, choosing solitude over certain relationships was not interpreted as emotional avoidance by default. In specific cases, it signaled something far more precise: a nervous system that had learned, through repeated experience, the real cost of emotional self-abandonment. When someone repeatedly stays connected by silencing their needs, tolerating inconsistency, or overriding internal discomfort, the attachment system adapts. It does not become colder, it becomes more selective. From this perspective, preferring to be alone is not a failure to bond. It is evidence that the psyche has updated its internal rules. The system learns that proximity without emotional safety produces dysregulation, confusion, and loss of coherence. Over time, the mind associates certain relational dynamics with danger, not because of fear, but because of pattern recognition. Solitude, then, becomes the more regulated state. Ainsworth's observations suggest that this choice is not conscious rebellion against intimacy. It is a protective recalibration. The psyche stops investing where connection requires self-erasure. What looks like detachment is often the result of attachment that has matured enough to refuse conditions that demand inner betrayal. Common sense often mislabels this pattern as emotional coldness, fear of intimacy, or an inability to trust. From the outside, choosing distance can look like avoidance. But through the lens of Mary Ainsworth, the meaning is inverted. In certain individuals, solitude does not emerge because the capacity to bond is damaged, but because the mind refuses to remain in relationships that require silence, over-accommodation, or the suppression of internal signals in order to maintain connection. This is not a withdrawal from closeness itself, but from conditions that make closeness unsafe. The psyche reaches a point where it no longer accepts emotional arrangements that demand constant compromise of inner truth. What others interpret as rigidity or distance is often a form of psychological integrity. The individual is no longer willing to trade clarity for belonging or self-respect for proximity. In this inversion, solitude becomes a healthier option than relational participation under false terms. It reflects an attachment system that has learned discernment. The person is not avoiding intimacy, they are avoiding self-erasure. And that distinction changes the moral framing entirely, transforming what looks like emotional limitation into evidence of internal coherence and adaptive maturity. Most human relationships operate through unconscious adaptation. From early on, people learn to adjust their tone, needs, and emotional expressions in order to preserve connection. Discomfort is often normalized, personal boundaries are blurred, and internal signals are ignored because maintaining the bond feels more important than maintaining coherence. For many, this process happens automatically and remains largely invisible, reinforced by social norms that reward compliance, flexibility, and emotional endurance. However, this adaptive mechanism has limits. When the cost of adaptation becomes chronic self-denial, the psyche begins to resist. The internal system recognizes that constant emotional compromise is no longer sustainable. At this point, the old strategy of adjusting breaks down, not because the person has become inflexible, but because the mind can no longer justify the loss of self that adaptation requires. When this threshold is crossed, the psyche generates a different solution: conscious withdrawal. Rather than endlessly reshaping itself to fit unstable or demanding relational environments, the mind chooses distance as a form of regulation. This withdrawal is not impulsive or reactive. It is deliberate, measured, and protective. It marks a shift from unconscious survival through adaptation to conscious self-preservation through boundaries. After repeated experiences of being used, emotionally destabilized, or subtly invalidated, the mind reaches a critical realization: connection without safety is too expensive. At first, the psyche tries to endure. It rationalizes, hopes, and gives the benefit of the doubt. It tells itself that discomfort is normal, that effort will eventually be rewarded, that closeness requires sacrifice. But over time, the emotional ledger stops balancing. What is given is no longer matched. What is tolerated begins to erode something essential. This is the point of rupture. Not a dramatic breaking, but a quiet internal decision. The mind recognizes that staying requires constant vigilance, emotional self-control, and the suppression of honest reactions. The nervous system remains on edge, never fully settled. At this stage, solitude no longer feels like loss. It feels like relief. From that moment on, empty relationships begin to hurt more than being alone. Silence becomes less painful than inconsistency. Distance feels more stable than unpredictable closeness. The psyche is no longer choosing isolation out of fear, but out of clarity. It has learned that safety is not optional, and without it, connection becomes a form of self-inflicted harm. Staying comes with a hidden psychological cost. It requires silencing internal signals that warn of imbalance or misalignment. It means minimizing discomfort, explaining it away, or reframing it as something insignificant just to keep the connection intact. Over time, the person learns to adapt to the emotional rhythm of the other, adjusting reactions, expectations, and even values to maintain a fragile sense of harmony. For this type of mind, that effort is not neutral. It drains energy, blurs perception, and slowly erodes self-trust. The more one stays, the more attention is diverted outward, monitoring moods, anticipating reactions, and managing emotional tension. Clarity fades because the internal compass is constantly overridden. What once felt like flexibility begins to feel like distortion. Eventually, the individual experiences a persistent sense of self-betrayal, not because of a single event, but because of the cumulative weight of ignoring oneself. Exhaustion sets in, not physical, but psychological, marked by numbness, confusion, and quiet resentment. At that point, leaving is not abandonment. It is an attempt to restore coherence, conserve energy, and re-establish a relationship with one's own internal truth. It is not a fear of loving, and it is not emotional shutdown. What is operating here is emotional memory. The body remembers the price that was paid when openness was met with inconsistency, when vulnerability was not held with care, when giving more did not create closeness, but depletion. Even if the mind wants to explain or forgive, the nervous system keeps the record. It knows what it costs to stay open without reciprocity. Because of this, solitude begins to feel more regulated than unstable presence. Being alone allows the system to settle. There is no need to scan for mixed signals, no emotional whiplash, no internal debate about whether one is asking for too much. Silence provides predictability. Distance provides coherence. The absence of the other feels calmer than the unpredictability of someone who is emotionally unavailable or inconsistent. This suffering often goes unnamed because it doesn't look dramatic. It looks like quiet withdrawal, reduced tolerance, and selective engagement. But it is not indifference. It is self-protection learned through experience. If this resonates with you, consider subscribing to the channel for deeper explorations like this, and share in the comments what you recognized first. The relief of solitude, the exhaustion of trying, or the moment you realized your body already knew the answer. At a certain point, the mind makes an unconventional choice. It begins to prefer being alone rather than being poorly accompanied. This decision is not driven by bitterness or rejection of love, but by a growing commitment to psychological integrity. The individual has learned that presence without safety creates internal fragmentation, while solitude preserves coherence. What once felt like emptiness now feels contained and manageable. This shift marks a form of advanced self-regulation. Instead of seeking relief through external validation or unstable connection, the psyche stabilizes itself through distance. Withdrawal becomes a way to calm the nervous system, reduce emotional noise, and restore inner balance. There is no dramatic cutting off, only a quiet reordering of priorities. In this state, solitude is no longer experienced as punishment or deficiency. It becomes a deliberate environment where the mind can function without constant compromise. The person is not closing their heart, but placing it in a context where it does not have to defend itself. The choice to step back is not a rejection of intimacy, but a refusal to engage in relational dynamics that erode self-respect and emotional clarity. At this stage, a deeper pattern emerges, the archetype of conscious withdrawal. This is not the figure of the recluse who rejects humanity, but of someone who has learned to listen inwardly with precision. The retreat does not come from indifference or superiority, but from an internal authority that recognizes when proximity begins to violate emotional limits. This person has developed the ability to distinguish between connection and intrusion, between closeness and self-loss. This archetype is rare because it requires a high degree of internal boundary awareness. Most people are trained to override their limits in the name of harmony, belonging, or fear of abandonment. In contrast, the individual who embodies conscious withdrawal trusts their internal signals more than external expectations. They step back not impulsively, but intentionally, guided by discernment rather than reaction. The withdrawal itself is calm, measured, and unapologetic. It reflects a psyche that no longer seeks permission to protect itself. By honoring their emotional thresholds, this individual preserves inner stability and coherence. What appears as distance is actually a mature response to overstimulation, misalignment, or relational imbalance, rooted in self-listening rather than emotional detachment. Solitude is no longer experienced as absence, but as a safe internal space. It becomes an environment where nothing has to be justified or translated. There is no need to explain emotional reactions, negotiate basic needs, or dilute sensitivity to remain acceptable. In solitude, the self is allowed to exist without adjustment, without performance, and without defense. This shift changes the emotional meaning of being alone. What once carried the weight of lack or exclusion becomes a form of refuge. Silence offers clarity instead of emptiness. Distance provides relief instead of loneliness. The nervous system relaxes because it is no longer required to stay alert, adapt constantly, or anticipate emotional friction. Within this space, sensitivity stops being a liability and becomes a source of information. The individual can feel fully without managing another person's response. Solitude allows for self-alignment, emotional honesty, and restoration. It is not chosen because it is ideal, but because it is regulated. In this redefinition, being alone is not a failure of connection, but a condition that preserves inner safety and psychological integrity. Within this pattern, 6 rare mental traits tend to emerge, not as conscious choices, but as natural adaptations shaped by experience. The first is an intolerance for inconsistent bonds. The mind can no longer normalize mixed signals, emotional unpredictability, or unstable availability. What once was endured now registers immediately as misalignment. Alongside this comes heightened sensitivity to micro-betrayals, subtle dismissals, broken, emotional rhythms, unspoken withdrawals. These are noticed quickly, not out of suspicion, but because the psyche has learned their cumulative cost. A third trait is early effective autonomy. Emotional regulation no longer depends on external reassurance, reducing the urgency to stay connected at any price. From this develops selective attachment. Connection is no longer widespread or indiscriminate, but intentional and rare. The individual bonds deeply or not at all. This is supported by a strong sense of internal coherence, an ability to feel when something is internally off and to trust that signal. Finally, there is the capacity to be alone without emotional collapse. Solitude does not trigger panic or emptiness, but stability. Together, these traits reflect a mind that values psychological integrity over constant connection. Not everyone develops this pattern. Many people would rather remain in any form of connection than face emptiness. For them, absence feels threatening, and even unstable bonds seem preferable to being alone. But for this group, the equation is reversed. They prefer emptiness to falseness, silence to emotional distortion, distance to proximity that requires pretending. This difference is not rooted in coldness or emotional deficiency. It comes from early learning about the cost of self-abandonment. Through experience, these individuals discovered that staying connected at the expense of inner truth creates deeper damage than being alone. The pain of falseness lingers longer than the discomfort of solitude. As a result, they no longer seek connection as proof of worth or safety. They are willing to tolerate the quiet space of being alone because it preserves integrity. What looks like withdrawal is actually a form of discernment. These individuals have learned that belonging loses its value when it requires them to disappear internally, and they choose coherence over company without resentment or fear. This pattern is often misunderstood because it does not fit familiar narratives. It is not isolation driven by bitterness or avoidance. It is not unresolved trauma expressing itself through emotional shutdown. It is a form of psychological self-preservation that emerges when the mind has learned, through lived experience, what it can no longer tolerate without harm. The withdrawal that occurs here is not reactive. It is measured and intentional. The individual is not escaping connection, but protecting internal coherence. They are responding to an internal signal that says safety matters more than proximity, and truth matters more than attachment at any cost. What is being preserved is not comfort, but integrity. Rather than collapsing under relational pressure, the psyche chooses stability. Rather than numbing itself to remain included, it chooses clarity. This is not the absence of desire for connection, but the refusal to engage in dynamics that fracture the self. In this synthesis, solitude becomes a stabilizing force and distance becomes an act of care. It is not withdrawal from life, but alignment with what allows you feel that being alone is less painful than constantly adjusting yourself to others, It does not mean that something in you is broken. It does not mean you have lost the ability to connect, or that you have become emotionally distant. It may mean that something in you has matured. Your mind has learned to recognize the difference between connection that nourishes and connection that slowly drains. At some point, you stopped overriding your inner signals for the sake of harmony. You noticed how often you had to edit your reactions, soften your truth, or carry emotional weight that was not yours. And instead of continuing to negotiate yourself away, you chose something quieter but steadier. You chose coherence over accommodation. This choice does not come from fear, but from clarity. It reflects a system that understands its limits and respects them. If solitude feels calmer than constant emotional adaptation, it may be because your psyche no longer confuses endurance with love. What you are experiencing is not detachment but discernment, not withdrawal from others, but a deeper alignment with yourself. He mind to remain whole. You do not need to force yourself to bond. You do not need to prove that you are open, available, or emotionally easy to be around. There is no obligation to perform warmth, accessibility, or constant receptivity, just to meet social expectations. Your system is not defective for hesitating. It has learned through experience when connection is safe and when it is not. Psychological permission begins with trusting that internal intelligence. Your nervous system is not overreacting. It is responding to patterns it has already mapped. When something feels off, heavy, or draining, that information matters. You are allowed to honor it without explanation or apology. Choosing not to engage does not mean rejecting intimacy forever. It means respecting timing, conditions, and context. You are allowed to wait for environments where presence does not require self-correction or emotional labor. This permission is not about closing yourself off, but about refusing to open where doing so would cost you clarity, stability, or inner truth. Solitude did not become your choice by accident. It became a refuge because, at some point, connection was not. There was a moment, or a series of moments, when closeness failed to provide safety, clarity, or reciprocity. The mind noticed. The body registered it. And quietly, without drama, something adapted. Your psyche learned that presence could carry tension, confusion, or self-erasure, while distance offered stability. This learning did not happen intellectually. It happened through lived experience, through repeated exposure to situations where being open required too much. Over time, solitude stopped feeling like loss and began to feel like relief. This is not a permanent verdict against connection. It is a pause shaped by wisdom, a state chosen not out of bitterness, but out of care. Your mind did not withdraw to disappear. It withdrew to protect what could not survive constant compromise. In this calm closing, solitude is not an ending, but a holding space, one that preserves integrity until safety becomes real again. This space is for those who learned how to protect themselves before learning how to connect again. For those who discovered that preserving inner truth mattered more than forcing belonging. Here, there is no pressure to perform openness, no demand to soften boundaries, no expectation to explain why solitude feels safer right now. This is not a place for emotional urgency, but for clarity. If these words resonated, it's because you recognize this quiet shift within yourself. You understand that integrity comes before companionship, and that real connection cannot be built on self-erasure. Staying here does not mean rejecting others. It means honoring your internal limits while you regain trust in your own signals. If this perspective reflects your experience, like the video to support this work. Subscribe if you want to continue exploring these deeper psychological patterns without noise or simplification. And share in the comments what stood out most for you: the relief of solitude, the clarity of boundaries, or the moment you stopped betraying yourself to belong.